They scorned humans as myths until their Armada shook the galaxy, before they realized their mistake, like if you believe humans are more dangerous when doubted. Enjoy the story. The galaxy had whispered of them for centuries. Phantoms from a forgotten epoch, shadows that danced between myth and memory. Humans, a species so impossibly stubborn that even extinction itself could not claim them, so resilient that the very concept of surrender seemed alien to their nature. No homeworld remained in the star charts to mark their passing. No monuments bore their names in the great halls of galactic power. No archives held their stories, just legends. Whispered tales told in hushed tones across 1,000 worlds of warriors who refused to yield even when the universe itself turned against them. Stories of a race that had once carved an empire from the void, only to vanish like smoke when the galaxy needed them most. Some said they had destroyed themselves in an orgy of violence. Others claimed they had simply faded away, unable to adapt to a changing cosmos. The Galactic Council ruled supreme now, their authority stretching like an iron fist across 10,000 systems. They believed themselves untouchable, their technology the pinnacle of advancement, their political machinery an unstoppable force that had brought order to the chaos of space. For 3 millennia, they had been the arbiters of justice, the keepers of peace, the ultimate authority in all matters of galactic significance. But when the Drek Dominion began its campaign of terror, swallowing entire civilizations in flames of conquest and reducing proud worlds to ash and memory, the Council's power showed its first cracks. Their mighty fleet, so impressive in parade formations, proved inadequate against an enemy that fought without honor, without mercy, without the restraint that had defined warfare for generations. No one could stop the Drek. No alliance could match their brutality. No strategy could counter their relentless advance. No one dared try. Until the day the sky above Xanthera Prime split open like a wound in reality itself, bleeding ships of war into a galaxy that had forgotten what true strength looked like. From the dimensional rift came ships unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed in living memory, angular scarred vessels bearing no insignia. Their hulls speaking of battles fought in the void between stars in the forgotten spaces where civilizations went to die. These were not the elegant cruisers of the Alvari with their flowing lines and crystalline beauty. These were not the organic bioships of the Zari swarm, pulsing with alien life. These were not the massive fortress ships of the Council fleet, bristling with ceremonial weapons and diplomatic quarters. These were something else entirely, something primal and terrifying in its simplicity. Weapons forged in desperation and tempered by survival, shaped by the kind of necessity that only came when extinction was not just a possibility but an expectation. Their dark metal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if the very material had been born in the heart of dying stars. The transmission that followed chilled every soul who heard it crackling through communication networks with an authority that demanded attention. The voice was human, unmistakably so, but it carried the weight of ages, the pain of centuries, the cold certainty of a species that had stared into the abyss and chosen to stare back. We are humanity. We have returned. 5 words, 5 simple words that sent shockwaves through the established order of the galaxy. In the command centers of 1,000 worlds, military analysts scrambled to verify what their sensors were telling them. In the halls of power, politicians who had never known fear suddenly understood what it meant to feel small and vulnerable in an infinite universe. General Drek Dominion aboard his flagship Devastator laughed at the announcement with the kind of bitter amusement that only came from absolute confidence in one's own power. The Devastator was a ship that had broken worlds, a weapon of such devastating capability that entire systems had surrendered rather than face its wrath. Its plasma batteries could glass a planet's surface in hours. Its hull had never been breached by enemy fire. To Korath, humans were ghost stories, myths to frighten recruits during their first deployment, legends whispered by cowards who needed something to blame for their own failures. His plasma cannons charged with a sound like thunder rolling across metal, ready to demonstrate the futility of challenging the Drek war machine that had conquered a third of the galaxy. The first shot erupted from Korath's warship like the birth of a new star, a lance of superheated death that should have vaporized any known vessel, reducing it to constituent atoms scattered across the cosmic wind. The plasma beam, hot enough to melt through asteroid belts, screamed across the void with the fury of a dying sun. But the human ship, UHS Retribution, absorbed the blast like a predator awakening from slumber. Its armor, black as the space between galaxies, glowed white-hot under the assault, but held firm, deflecting energies that should have been impossible to withstand. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the ship hung there in space, wreathed in the dissipating fury of Korath's attack, silent and unmoved. And then it responded. What came back was not elegant energy beams or sophisticated missiles guided by artificial intelligences. It was raw destruction, made manifest kinetic projectiles the size of buildings moving at speeds that burned space itself, leaving trails of ionized particles in their wake like the signatures of falling angels. They slammed into the Drek formation with the force of dying stars each impact, carrying the accumulated momentum of humanity's return. The shields, designed to withstand council weaponry energy barriers that had laughed off the finest weapons the galaxy could produce, shattered like crystal under the hammer blow of human vengeance. In seconds, Korath's perfect formation became a debris field of twisted metal and escaping atmosphere, the proud ships of the Drek Dominion reduced to scrap by an enemy they had dismissed as legend. Prime Minister Laura Bennett of the Alvari Dominion stood in the Council's grand chamber, her silver eyes reflecting the holographic reports streaming across the hall like a river of digital information. The architecture around her spoke of millennia of accumulated power, crystalline pillars that reached toward a ceiling, lost in shadows, each one inscribed with the names of species that had bent the knee to council authority. The humans had arrived with barely 100 ships, a laughable force compared to the thousands under Drek, command a mere fraction of what any serious military power would deploy for even a minor campaign. Ancient relics, scoffed Lord Zari Tharok, his mandibles clicking with the kind of disdain reserved for enemies who dared to challenge the natural order. The Zari had served as the Council's enforcers for 2,000 years, their reputation for brutal efficiency earning them both fear and respect across the galaxy. To see Tharok so dismissive was almost reassuring. Surely his warrior instincts would have detected any real threat. They'll be destroyed within hours. Korath's fleet will make short work of these ghosts. But Admiral John Carter, standing on the bridge of the Retribution, watched the enemy formations with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. His weathered face, marked by years of command and loss, showed no emotion as tactical displays painted the surrounding space in geometric patterns of death. Every ship position, every weapon signature, every quantum fluctuation in the enemy fleet was catalogued and analyzed by minds that had learned to see warfare as both art and science. Captain Sarah Hayes approached from the tactical station, her expression mixing professional respect with the barely contained anticipation of a warrior who had waited too long for this moment. She had served under Carter for 15 years, through campaigns that existed only in classified files, through battles that the galaxy would never know had saved it from extinction. Her survival skills had been honed in the crucible of void warfare, where a single mistake meant not just death, but the kind of obliteration that left no trace for anyone to mourn. "They think we're a legend, Admiral," Hayes remarked, checking her tactical display with the practiced ease of someone who could read death patterns like others read poetry. Ghost stories don't usually shoot back this effectively. Carter's blue eyes cold as the space between galaxies never left the viewport where enemy formations wheeled through space in patterns that spoke of arrogance rather than tactical wisdom. "Let them underestimate us," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect from both allies and enemies. "It's worked before. You see, the AI Omen's synthetic voice cut through the bridge chatter with the emotionless precision that only artificial intelligence could achieve. Drek fleet positioning suggests full frontal assault. They show no tactical adaptation for our weapon systems. Enemy formation indicates they expect conventional energy-based engagement protocols. A grim smile touched Carter's lips, the expression of someone who had learned that the greatest victories often came from being underestimated. The Drek had spent centuries perfecting their survival skills against energy weapons and conventional tactics, developing counters for every known form of warfare the galaxy could deploy. Their ships were armored against plasma beams, their shields calibrated to deflect particle weapons. Their battle doctrines written in the blood of countless enemies who had tried and failed to match their brutal efficiency. But humanity had learned different lessons in the void lessons written in the blood of a species that had faced extinction and emerged stronger, harder, more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Their weapons were not just advanced. They were alien to galactic understanding based on principles that the Council's greatest scientists had abandoned as primitive centuries ago. Kinetic weapons, projectile systems, the kind of brute force technology that civilized species had long since discarded in favor of more elegant solutions. It was this very primitiveness that made them so devastating. Who builds shields against rocks when you expect energy beams? Who prepares for projectiles when the galaxy fights with plasma? When the second wave of Drek ships approached expecting easy prey marked for slaughter, they found instead a wolf pack. Human vessels moved with terrifying precision through space, each ship part of a greater pattern that spoke of countless hours of drill and preparation. Each shot was calculated not just for immediate effect, but for its contribution to the overall tactical picture. Each maneuver was practiced until it became instinct, until the fleet moved like a single organism with a single purpose. Their future tech wasn't flashy. There were no brilliant energy displays or impossible technologies that bent the laws of physics. Instead, it was efficient, brutal, and absolutely lethal in its simplicity, targeting systems that could predict enemy movement patterns 3 moves ahead, armor that could redistribute kinetic energy across its entire surface, weapons that hit with such force that shields designed to stop energy beams simply disintegrated under the impact. The Drek had perfected the art of conquest through fear and overwhelming force. But they had never faced an enemy that fought not for conquest or glory, but for the simple right to exist in a universe that had forgotten them. The battle for Xanthera Prime began with Drek arrogance and ended with their terror. General Korath had deployed his finest battlecruiser ships that had reduced entire systems to ash and reduced proud civilizations to footnotes in history books that would never be written. Each vessel was a masterpiece of destructive engineering, carrying enough firepower to level continents and enough armor to withstand the combined assault of most planetary defense fleets. These were not mere warships. They were mobile fortresses designed to project power across the galaxy and enforce the will of those who believed might made right. But against the humans, they became nothing more than targets, expensive, slow-moving targets whose every strength had become a weakness in the face of an enemy that fought by rules they had never learned. Lieutenant Emily Chen piloted her frigate Steel Dawn through the chaos with the kind of calm precision that only came from years of combat experience. Her survival skills had been honed through decades of void warfare, through campaigns fought in systems whose names were classified beyond the highest security clearances. She had learned to read the flow of battle like others read weather patterns, to sense the rhythm of violence that separated the living from the dead in the infinite darkness of space. As Drek fighters swarmed around her ship like angry insects, their plasma cannons painting the void with deadly light, she transmitted a message in their own language, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had already decided to make them pay for every aggressive act they had ever committed. You think we're gone? You're wrong. The human fleet fought with a discipline that bordered on supernatural, each ship moving in perfect coordination with its companions despite the chaos surrounding them. This wasn't the desperate scrambling of species fighting for survival. This was the calculated dance of predators who had spent centuries perfecting their art. Each ship knew its role in the greater pattern, each captain understood the dance of death they were performing, with an enemy that had never faced anything like their coordinated fury. This wasn't just warfare, it was art painted in the destruction of their enemies, a masterpiece written in the language of kinetic weapons and tactical precision. Every movement served multiple purposes, every attack created opportunities for the next assault, every defensive maneuver opened new angles of attack that the enemy couldn't possibly anticipate. Prime Minister Bennett watched in growing horror as the tactical display shifted from confident blue markers, representing Drek superiority, to the angry red of cascading system failures. The Drek masters of brutal efficiency, who had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries, were being outmaneuvered at every turn by an enemy that seemed to predict their moves before they made them. "How?" she whispered to her aide, her voice barely audible above the constant stream of reports flooding the communication channels. "How are they adapting so quickly? The Drek have never been defeated in open battle. Their tactics are proven across 1,000 campaigns." The answer came from Omen's analysis aboard the Retribution, delivered with the cold precision that only artificial intelligence could achieve. Enemy force reduction at 97%. Human casualties minimal. Tactical assessment, enemy adaptation rate insufficient to counter human strategic flexibility. But it was more than superior tactics that gave humanity the edge in this cosmic game of death. It was something the galaxy had forgotten in its pursuit of civilized warfare and political solutions, the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who couldn't protect themselves. When General Korath, desperate and facing the complete destruction of his fleet, launched a planet-killer missile toward the civilian colonies of Xanthera, Prime, he expected the humans to face an impossible choice: pursue his fleeing forces or save innocent lives. He had misjudged them completely. Lieutenant Emily Chen didn't hesitate when the massive warhead appeared on her sensors, its quantum signature marking it as a weapon capable of sterilizing entire continents. There was no debate, no calculation of odds, no moment of doubt. She simply altered course and pushed her engines beyond their rated capacity racing to intercept a weapon that would kill millions if it reached its target. Her ship intercepted the warhead in the upper atmosphere of Xanthera Prime, the explosion lighting the sky like a second sun rising over a world that had been saved by the sacrifice of someone who had never set foot on its surface. The detonation was visible from orbit, a brief star that bloomed and faded in seconds, taking with it both the threat to innocent lives and the woman who had chosen their safety over her own survival. Her final transmission echoed across every receiver in the system, carried by communication networks that suddenly found themselves broadcasting the last words of a hero for Earth. 2 words that carried the weight of an entire civilization's loss, a species' determination and a promise that some things were worth dying for. The Drek fleet, stunned by such selfless sacrifice from an enemy they had expected to behave like conquerors, faltered for a crucial moment that stretched into eternity. Admiral Carter seized the opportunity with the reflexes of a predator that had waited centuries for this moment, ordering a full assault that left Korath's forces in ruins scattered across the void. The general himself was captured, his pride shattered along with his fleet, his reputation destroyed by an enemy he had dismissed as myth. The mighty Drek Dominion terror of the galaxy for 3 centuries had been broken by a force they had refused to take seriously until it was far too late. In the aftermath of Emily Chen's sacrifice, something fundamental shifted in the cosmic order like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every shore. The Drek Dominion terror of the galaxy for 3 centuries, and the nightmare that had haunted the dreams of countless civilizations, had been broken in mere hours. Their survivors fled in panic through hyperspace, abandoning conquered worlds and leaving behind the infrastructure of oppression they had spent generations building. Human ships pursued with relentless efficiency, not for revenge but for justice, ensuring that no remnant of the Drek war machine could rise again to threaten innocent lives. But it wasn't just military victory that shook the foundations of galactic power to their very core. It was what the humans did next that truly terrified those who had grown comfortable with the old ways of conquest and domination. Prime Minister Bennett received reports that defied everything she understood about the nature of conquest information, that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which galactic politics had operated for millennia. On worlds liberated from Drek control, the humans weren't slaughtering populations in revenge for past collaboration. They weren't claiming resources as spoils of war. They weren't establishing military governments or demanding tribute from grateful populations. They were rebuilding. Hospitals rose from ruins with construction techniques that spoke of advanced engineering principles. Trade routes reopened under human protection, bringing prosperity to systems that had known only fear and exploitation. Agricultural centers that had been strip-mined by Drek resource extraction began producing food again. Most remarkably of all, children who had known only the terror of occupation began to laugh again, their voices carrying across communication networks that now broadcast hope instead of propaganda. "This isn't conquest," whispered Nathan Klein, the Alari diplomat, studying the holographic feeds from a dozen liberated worlds with growing amazement. His species had been among the first to join the Council, and he had seen every form of post-war occupation the galaxy had to offer. This was different. This was something unprecedented in galactic history. This is something else entirely, something we don't have words for. Admiral Carter stood before a gathering of liberated world leaders in the Great Hall of what had once been a Drek command center, his presence commanding absolute attention from beings who had never expected to see freedom again. The chamber had been stripped of its intimidating decorations and weapons displays replaced with simple tables, where former slaves now sat as equals with their liberators. "We are not here to replace your oppressors," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, earned through centuries of loss and determination. "We're here to ensure you never need to fear them again. Your worlds are your own. Your futures are your own. We ask only that you remember who stood with you when darkness seemed absolute." The words rippled across the galaxy through networks both official and underground, spreading from world to world with the speed of quantum communication and the power of hope long denied. For the first time in centuries, someone had appeared who could back such promises with action, who possessed the strength to protect the weak without demanding submission in return. Entire systems began declaring independence from the Council, not to join chaos, but to align with the mysterious human forces that offered protection without exploitation. The great political machinery that had maintained order through fear and bureaucracy suddenly found itself facing the one thing it had never been designed to handle willing: defection based on genuine hope for a better future. Captain Hayes approached Carter with the latest intelligence reports, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with something approaching wonder. "Admiral 17 more systems have requested protection. They're offering resources, manpower, even their fleets, not as tribute, but as allies." Carter nodded grimly, understanding the historical significance of what was happening around them. In all the galactic histories he had studied, conquest had always followed the same pattern: the strong dominated the weak, who either submitted or were destroyed. But humanity had learned different lessons in their exile lessons about the kind of strength that actually lasted. "They understand what the Council never did," he said, watching through the viewport as human construction ships worked alongside local crews to rebuild a orbital defense platform. "True strength protects the weak, it doesn't exploit them. And when you protect people without asking for anything in return, they become more than allies, they become family." The philosophical implications of this approach were staggering to observers who had grown up in a galaxy where power was measured by the ability to force compliance. The humans weren't building an empire in the traditional sense. They were creating something that had no precedent in galactic history: a voluntary association based on mutual protection and shared values rather than fear and dominance. Meanwhile, in the deeper regions of space where the remaining Drek forces had fled, General Korath sat in the brig of a human ship staring at walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His proud uniform had been replaced with simple prisoner garments, and his legendary arrogance had been stripped away by the reality of absolute defeat. Through a small viewport, he could see human ships working with former Drek slaves to dismantle the infrastructure of oppression he had spent his life building. For the first time in his career, Korath began to understand that he had never been fighting an enemy, he had been fighting an idea, and ideas he was beginning to realize were far more dangerous than any weapon the galaxy had ever produced. The transformation was undeniable and accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. Worlds that had suffered under Drek tyranny for generations were not just free, they were thriving in ways that challenged every assumption about post-conflict recovery. The humans had brought more than weapons and tactical superiority. They had brought hope, and hope was proving to be the most contagious force in the galaxy. Prime Minister Bennett found herself facing an impossible situation that grew more complex with each passing day. Half the Council's member worlds were defecting, drawn to humanity's promise of protection, without subjugation, like moths to a flame that promised warmth instead of destruction. The other half demanded immediate military action against what they increasingly saw as an existential threat to the established order, calling for a preemptive strike before the humans could consolidate their growing influence. "We should negotiate," Bennett argued before the emergency assembly, her voice carrying a desperation that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The council chamber, usually a model of controlled deliberation, had become a cauldron of fear and conflicting loyalties. "They've shown they're willing to spare those who don't stand against them. Every world they've liberated has been treated with dignity and respect." Lord Tharok's response was predictably violent, his mandibles clicking with the kind of aggressive certainty that had served the Zari well in simpler times. "They destroyed the Drek. An entire civilization wiped from existence. What makes you think we're safe? What makes you think they won't turn on us the moment it becomes convenient?" But General Zareth Kalvarkis, his scaled features, thoughtful in a way that spoke of deeper consideration, offered a different perspective that cut through the chamber's growing hysteria. "The Drek were conquerors, enslavers, destroyers of worlds. We are something else. Perhaps that matters to them. Perhaps they judge by actions, not species." The answer came when Bennett received an unexpected transmission that changed the entire dynamic of the crisis, a direct message from Admiral Carter himself, broadcast on all channels, with an authority that made it impossible to ignore. "Prime Minister Bennett, we need to talk." The meeting took place aboard the Retribution in a chamber that spoke of function over form, but also of a deeper philosophy about the nature of power. The room was simple, almost austere, but it radiated a sense of purpose that was somehow more intimidating than any throne room or ceremonial hall. Carter's presence was magnetic, intimidating, yet not entirely hostile, the bearing of someone who held ultimate power, but chose restraint. "Your council has a choice," he said without preamble, his blue eyes fixing on Bennett with the intensity of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall. "Stand with us or stand aside, but do not stand against us." Bennett gathered her courage, drawing on reserves of diplomatic training that suddenly seemed inadequate for the magnitude of this moment. "What exactly do you want, Admiral? What are humanity's terms for peace?" Carter's eyes cold as the void itself, but somehow not entirely without warmth, met hers with a directness that was both refreshing and terrifying. "Justice, and the location of Earth." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying implications that Bennett's mind struggled to process. Earth, the legendary homeworld of humanity, the place that existed only in the most ancient records and the most persistent myths. A world that, according to every historical account she had ever studied, had been destroyed in some cataclysmic event that marked the end of humanity's first empire. But if these humans were here, if they had survived their supposed extinction, then what had really happened to Earth? And why did Carter's voice carry such pain when he spoke its name? The implications were staggering, suggesting possibilities that challenged everything the Council had taught about galactic history. The very existence of these human ships, their advanced technology, their military discipline, all of it pointed to a civilization that had not just survived, but had evolved, grown stronger in the darkness between stars. Earth. Bennett breathed, her diplomatic composure cracking slightly under the weight of revelation. But Earth was destroyed. Every record confirms it. The historical consensus is unanimous across every species in the Council. The archives of 12 different civilizations all corroborate the same timeline. Humanity's homeworld was lost in a cataclysmic event that marked the end of your first empire. Carter's smile was cold and terrible, the expression of someone who had discovered that history was written by those who survived to tell it, and the truth was often the first casualty of convenience. History is written by the victor's prime minister, and we were never allowed to tell our story. We were erased from the narrative, reduced to footnotes and legends, our truth buried beneath layers of convenient lies. His voice carried the weight of centuries of pain of a species that had been forced to watch from the shadows as their legacy was systematically destroyed. But we remembered. In the depths of space, in the cold, between the stars, we kept our history alive. We passed down the truth from generation to generation, even when it would have been easier to forget, even when forgetting would have meant peace. The revelation hit Bennett like a physical blow, the kind of impact that left her reeling both mentally and spiritually. Earth, humanity's birth world, the cradle of their civilization, hadn't been destroyed in some ancient war or natural cataclysm. It had vanished. No coordinates remained in any star chart. No debris field marked its location, no gravitational anomalies suggested where a planet had once orbited its star. It was as if the entire solar system had been carefully excised from reality itself, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Impossible. Bennett breathed, her voice barely audible above the subtle hum of the ship's life support systems. Entire planets don't just disappear. There are laws of physics, conservation of mass quantum signatures that can't be erased. A world that size a star system with that much history, something that significant, doesn't just vanish without leaving evidence. Carter's expression was granite carved from the kind of determination that only came from centuries of loss, and the absolute certainty that somewhere in the galaxy answers waited to be found. They do when someone with enough power and advanced future tech wants them erased from history. Someone who knew that as long as Earth existed, as long as there was a place humans could call home, humanity would never truly be defeated. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning every assumption Bennett had ever held about galactic history and the nature of the Council she had served her entire life. The implications were staggering, not just the technical capability required to hide an entire world, but the political conspiracy that would have been necessary to maintain such a secret across millennia. Bennett's mind raced through the implications like a computer processing data at the speed of thought. The Council's ancient archives, sealed for millennia and accessible only to the highest levels of government. The gaps in historical records that had always been explained as data corruption or natural decay. The convenient amnesia about humanity's former empire that had always seemed slightly suspicious to serious historians. "You think she began, her voice catching as the full magnitude of the accusation became clear. "I think someone in your council orchestrated the greatest cover-up in galactic history." Carter interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction earned through centuries of investigation and loss. "And we're going to find out who. We're going to find out why. And we're going to make sure it never happens again." The AI Omen's voice echoed through the chamber with its characteristic lack of emotion, delivering news that transformed the conversation from diplomatic negotiation to the prelude of war. Admiral Council fleet movements detected. 17 battle groups moving to intercept our advance fleets. Total vessel, count 4,347 ships of the line. Carter's smile was predatory, the expression of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it across decades of planning. "They've made their choice?" he said, turning to Bennett with eyes that seemed to look straight through her to the corruption he believed festered at the heart of galactic government. "Tell your council this: every ship they send against us brings them closer to the truth. And when we find it, there will be a reckoning that spans galaxies." Bennett felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders as she realized that she was witnessing the moment when the old order died and something new was born. The humans weren't just seeking revenge for some ancient betrayal, they were hunting for answers that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of its own past. And if those answers implicated the Council and Earth's disappearance, if the people she had served her entire life were responsible for the kind of crime that transcended normal concepts of evil, then war was not just inevitable, it was morally necessary. As Bennett's shuttle departed the Retribution, she carried with her the weight of terrible knowledge and an impossible choice. She could return to the Council and deliver Carter's message, triggering a war that would tear the galaxy apart. Or she could use her security clearance to access the sealed archives to search for the truth that Carter believed lay hidden in the deepest vaults of Council power. The humans weren't just seeking revenge, they were hunting for their stolen home, their erased history, their murdered past, and they possessed both the power and the determination to tear down every institution in the galaxy to find what they were looking for. The Council's attempt at military resistance was futile, a desperate gesture that only served to demonstrate how completely the balance of power had shifted in the galaxy. Their combined fleets, impressive against any known threat, and accumulated over millennia of expansion and conquest, were swept aside by humanity's advance with almost casual efficiency that spoke of superiority so complete it bordered on the supernatural. The humans had perfected their future tech not for show or intimidation, but for war, and they fought like a species that had learned survival skills in the harshest crucible imaginable, where failure meant not just defeat but the complete erasure of everything they held dear. Each battle was a masterclass in tactical precision, each victory a demonstration of power that had been refined by centuries of preparation for this moment. World after world chose humanity over the Council not through conquest or coercion, but through conviction, born of witnessing what true protection looked like. The humans offered something the galaxy had forgotten was possible protection, without exploitation, strength without tyranny, order without oppression. They didn't demand tribute or submission. They simply asked that those they protected remember who had stood with them when darkness seemed absolute. Prime Minister Bennett stood in her private chambers reading the final report that would change everything she believed about the civilization she had served her entire life. The sealed archives had yielded their secrets to her diplomatic clearance, revealing records that had been hidden for thousands of years, files that painted a picture of betrayal so complete and devastating that it challenged her fundamental understanding of galactic history. General Korath was dead, executed for crimes against countless civilizations in a trial that had been broadcast across the galaxy. The Drek Dominion was erased, their empire absorbed into humanity's growing sphere of influence, like a cancer excised from the body of galactic civilization. But the real revelation lay in the ancient records. Bennett had uncovered documents that told a story of betrayal that spanned centuries and implicated the highest levels of Council authority in crimes beyond imagination. The sealed records told a story that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about its own past. When the ancient enemy had come a threat so terrible that even the classified records dared not name it directly, referring to it only as the Hunger, the Council had faced an impossible choice. They could stand with humanity and face annihilation alongside their strongest ally, or they could sacrifice Earth itself to save their own worlds. They had chosen survival over honor. Rather than stand with humanity and face the coming darkness together, they had sacrificed Earth itself, using their most guarded future tech to fold space around the entire system and hide it in dimensional exile. The technology existed. Bennett had seen the specifications in files so classified that their very existence was a state secret. Dimensional manipulation on a planetary scale, the kind of future tech that could make an entire solar system simply disappear. The humans had been left to face extinction alone, abandoned by allies who had chosen their own survival over loyalty and justice, and somehow, impossibly, they had survived. Not just survived, they had grown stronger in exile, forging themselves into something harder and more determined than the galaxy had ever seen. Now, Admiral Carter stood on the bridge of the Retribution, reading Bennett's confession with the same cold expression he wore in battle, his blue eyes reflecting the pain of centuries and the terrible satisfaction of vindication finally achieved. 20 billion people, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a grief that had been carried across generations. An entire world, all to save your own skins. Captain Hayes approached with the latest reports, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with something approaching wonder at the scope of their victory. Admiral, the last Council strongholds are surrendering. They're requesting mercy, offering full capitulation in exchange for their continued existence. Carter looked out at the stars that had once seemed so empty, so devoid of the home that had been stolen from his people. The void no longer felt hostile, it felt full of possibility, pregnant with the promise of justice finally achieved. Mercy. He considered the word, tasting it like something foreign. They'll get the same mercy they showed Earth. But as he spoke, monuments were already rising on 1,000 worlds, stone pillars, carved with humanity's story, ensuring that never again would they be forgotten or dismissed as myth. The inscriptions told the true story of a species that had been betrayed by those they trusted, abandoned by those they had fought to protect, and yet had refused to surrender even when faced with impossible odds. The weakest species in galactic memory had become its strongest protector not through conquest or dominance, but through the simple refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. The Council's age of political maneuvering and convenient compromises was over. In its place stood something new, an order based on the revolutionary idea that strength existed to protect the innocent, not exploit them. And somewhere in the folded dimensions of space, beyond the reach of conventional sensors, but not beyond the hope of human determination, Earth waited for its children to bring it home. The technology that had hidden it still existed, recorded in the archives Bennett had uncovered. The dimensional coordinates were recoverable. The greatest theft in galactic history could be undone. The age of the Council was over. The age of humanity had begun. And across 1,000 worlds, beings who had never known what it meant to be truly protected began to understand that legends sometimes returned not as myths, but as salvation. In the growing twilight of galactic history, as old powers crumbled and new hopes rose like stars being born, the truth became clear. True power lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect them. Humanity had learned this lesson in the harshest school imaginable, and now they were teaching it to a galaxy that had forgotten what strength really meant. The echoes in stone would carry their story forward through the ages, ensuring that future generations would remember the price of betrayal and the power of those who refused to yield, even when the universe itself seemed to demand their surrender. The human fleet had become more than a military force. It had become a symbol of hope that transcended species boundaries. Refugees who had never heard of Earth spoke its name with reverence. Children born under alien suns learned human songs of defiance and protection. The galaxy was changing one world at a time, one heart at a time, one choice at a time. What made this transformation so profound wasn't just the military victory or even the political upheaval. It was the fundamental shift in what galactic civilization understood about the nature of power itself. For millennia, strength had been measured by the ability to force compliance, to extract tribute, to maintain order through fear and superior firepower. The Council had perfected this model, creating a system where peace was maintained through the threat of overwhelming retaliation. But humanity offered something radically different: protection without price alliance, without submission, strength without exploitation. They asked nothing from those they defended except that they remember who had stood with them when darkness seemed absolute. This wasn't just a new military doctrine, it was a new form of civilization entirely. The ripple effects were already beginning to reshape galactic society in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. Trade routes that had been controlled by Council monopolies were opening to independent merchants. Scientific research that had been restricted to Council-approved institutions was being shared freely among allied worlds. Cultural exchanges that had been filtered through diplomatic protocols were happening directly between populations. Most remarkably, species that had been enemies for centuries were finding common ground in their shared experience of human protection. The Zelthari and the Proxim, locked in territorial disputes for 3 generations, had signed a peace treaty aboard a human ship. The Crystalline Confederacy had opened their borders to Organic League refugees, something that would have been unthinkable under the old system of council-mediated relationships. And in the deepest archives of the defeated council, sealed records awaited discovery that would reveal not just the location of Earth, but the true scope of the conspiracy that had tried to erase humanity from existence. The trail of evidence led to names, to coordinates, to the architects of genocide who had thought themselves beyond justice. These weren't just bureaucrats or politicians. They were individuals who had made the conscious choice to sacrifice an entire species for their own survival, who had spent centuries maintaining the lie that had stolen Earth from its children. Admiral Carter stood before the holographic star map, his finger tracing the empty space where Earth should have been, where 20 billion souls waited in dimensional exile for their children to bring them home. The search would begin at dawn, but Carter knew that the rescue of Earth was only the beginning. The real work, rebuilding a galaxy based on justice rather than convenience, on protection rather than exploitation, would take generations. But for the first time in centuries, it seemed possible. The search would begin at dawn. The greatest rescue mission in galactic history was about to commence. But more than that, the greatest transformation in galactic civilization was already underway, written in the stars by those who had refused to be forgotten. The legend of humanity lives on in these HFY stories of triumph against impossible odds, proving that true strength comes not from power, but from the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Like and subscribe if you believe that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that legends never truly die, they just wait for the right moment to return. What do you think happened to Earth in its dimensional exile? How did humanity survive and grow stronger? Share your theories in the comments below. The next chapter of this saga awaits, and the search for Earth is just beginning.